Okay, this is part one of a five-part series of AP Psychology Review. And in part one, we're going to go over the methods. What is psychology? What are the different methods, its history and theories, and the research methods especially. And then we'll look at social psychology and a little bit, which are social psychology provides great examples of some ethical flaws in how they mess with people scientifically and some flaws in the research a little bit there. So that's why we include that here. It's kind of a series, throughout the series, it'll be games, and you can pause at any moment if you want to consider it further before I show you the answers to some of the little quizzes I throw at you. In any case, here we go. Part one, methods of psychology. So in this one, we're going to have a little game in which I'll give you clues on the right side of the screen. And then you need to identify which theoretical perspective it goes with. Now, this is a really important stuff because this is like the framework of all psychology. These theoretical perspectives, it's different theories of why we are the way we are and how we should approach studying human thought and behavior. So you definitely need to have this down. So let's see how you do. Again, pause at any point if you want to consider it further, but your options are on the left. And these are in order, by the way, chronologically of when they emerged in the history of psychology. So, first, perception of the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And this would be a clue as to a kind of optical illusion. So, which of these theoretical perspectives would this go with? And the answer is Gestalt, the whole perception. They're all about sensation and perception in Gestalt psychology. Next. And the answer is biomedical. And by the way, I just want to say this. The latest trend is biomedical. They're trying to explain everything that's psychological is simultaneously biological or physical in some way. Some brain part or brain chemistry involved in why that emotion happens or whatever. So this is a big area of psychology now. Next. And the answer is functionalism. So the first American theory, once it comes over from Europe after the structuralists, was functionalism. William James is one of the important people, and G. Stanley Hall is another guy who helped Americanize psychology. They created the APA, the American Psychological Association. They saw consciousness in a different way than the structuralists. They were more interested in its function or purpose and how it allows us to adapt and survive. Evolutionary theory was a big part of it as well, so adaptation and such. And in fact, why do we have consciousness? According to James, it allows us to adapt and survive in a harsh ice age environment, perhaps. So stream of consciousness is a phrase that William James coined as well. Consciousness is not a fixed structure, it's a flowing stream. It adapts to different situations and environments. And this, by the way, is also a very practical area of psychology. It's not all research in a laboratory, as the structuralists tended to be. They wanted to get out there into the world and help people in business and in schools and apply psychology. So it's more practical or applicable psychology. All right, moving on. And the answer, humanists. Okay, the humanist psychologists, of course, like Rogers and Maslow, are interested in, anytime you hear terms like fulfill your potential or achieve self-actualization or find meaning or, build a meaning for your life, that is very much humanist psychology that emerged in the kind of the 60s, maybe a little earlier in the 50s. And so hierarchy of needs is what we're looking at here. So Rogers and Maslow would be two guys you'd want to associate with humanist psychology. Positive psychology is more recent spin on that, which is more also contemplates meaning and existential issues, but tries to look at it scientifically. The science of human flourishing these days is a big topic in positive psychology. Next. And the answer is cognitive psychology. Now, cognitive psychology, cognition means thinking or understanding or knowing. And so this is, after around the 1950s, this becomes big as they were trying to understand how we process information very much like these things they were calling computers. Computers were invented at the time. So information processing, how we store memory, why we forget, how we solve problems and make decisions and creative decision making. Linguistics and how language is also tied with thinking and decision making. IQ, testing IQ, psychometrics, multiple intelligences, and so on. It's important, by the way, not to mix up cognition with like brain, like biological stuff. This is more what it does, not what it is, not the physical stuff as much, although those are merging recent years. Next. And the answer is structuralism. Now, the structuralist was the very first school of thought in psychology. They had emerged in the 1800s. Wilhelm Wundt, or Wundt, German guy, was known as the father of psychology. He created these laboratories to study human consciousness. And what they would do, the structuralists like Wundt, they would have people look inward at their own thought process when they're presented with stimuli. That looking inward is called introspection. That's a popular question on the AP exam, by the way. Knowing that structuralists used introspection, this looking inward process in the laboratory to try to understand the structures of consciousness. Also empiricism, like empirical means evidence, E for evidence, E for empirical. So they try to create this new science called psychology, and it's a science, not a philosophy so much. It's evidence-based. So you do research and you gather data. So all right. As we were comparing with the functionalists, which were more applied or practical, the structuralists were more of a research orientation. Next. And the answer is the behaviorists. So behaviorism is important that you understand. Emerged in the 1920s, the 1930s, and gets pretty popular then and into the 40s and mid 20th century. And as far as when I was mentioning empiricism, evidence-based science, these guys were the most diehard. And they, in fact, to be evidence-based, they would say, you can't really study consciousness. And they didn't. They had no interest in it. It was only behavior, because you can actually see behavior. You can't read somebody's mind. And there wasn't as many like brain imaging devices at the time. So you don't have data that way. So to be a scientist, an empirical scientist, the behaviorists said you got to rely on what you can see, which is behavior. So you mess with an animal or person and see how they respond. So stimulus and response. A lot of animal psychology was done here. Rats in the mazes, pigeons in the cages. So the psychology of learning, and by learning we mean very basic stimulus response habits, training an animal to do something or whatever by manipulating the environment. It's all about the environment here. They have no interest in personality really at all. So conditioning or training using manipulations of the environment. Famous people here, Watson, Pavlov before him, but he's not really a psychologist, but getting the dog to salivate to a bell by manipulating the environmental situation, associating stimuli, well, that was Pavlov. And then Watson did that with a little kid, if you remember the story of little Albert, the orphan, who they trained to become afraid of furry things by making noises whenever he would see a rat. And then Skinner was probably the most popular of them, and he trained pigeons to do all kinds of crazy things. And the answer? Psychodynamic theory. So psychodynamic theory is also called psychoanalysis or Freudian theory. It's important to know synonym alerts, here. So no different words they might throw at you on the AP exam. Of course, this is Freud and Jung, or Jung, right? And Adler. These guys were interested in consciousness, but they believe consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. If you really want to understand somebody at a deep level, then below the surface is the subconscious or unconscious forces that really they're not even aware of why they're doing what they're doing. Unlike the behaviorists, these are very much interested in personality and why you are the way you are at a deep, deep level. But this lacks kind of that empirical evidence. There's not a lot of evidence of why you're dreaming what you're dreaming, but these guys put a lot of stake in that. So, all right. So that takes care of kind of the theoretical perspectives. It's important that you understand their different interests and beliefs about approaching an understanding of human beings. The subfields of psychology. I'm going to put this here and let you pause on it and see if you can match these up correctly with the different subfields. Go ahead and pause now if you need more time. But here are the answers. All right, so by gist is psychologist, right? So please understand that a psychologist is someone with a PhD, doctorate in psychology, but they don't prescribe drugs. They're not medical doctors. That's a psychiatrist, which is number 7 there. So a psychiatrist is not a PhD doctor. They are a medical doctor who then specializes in that area, and then they can prescribe drugs and such. But that's a psychiatrist as opposed to a psychologist. And some of the others here you can see, let's see, IO psychology, the last one, industrial or organizational psychology is looking at how psychology can help businesses, recruit or hire the right kind of people or reorganize things to make more productive workers and such. So the largest area, probably the one to put a star by here, the most largest area of psychology, the biggest slice of the pie, is clinical psychology. And that's the one where they're working with people diagnosing and treating mental illness. Not necessarily working in a clinic per se, but I mean, it's called clinical. They might work in a clinic or a hospital, but not necessarily. Some of these overlap too. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. So, all right. There's more than just these subfields, by the way, but this is just some of them. Okay, now on this one, I'm going to show you, these are 4 different research methods in psychology, and they all have their pros and cons. So let's play a little game. I'll call out some characteristic of them, advantage or disadvantage, and you tell me which one it is. So let's see, which of these would be the one that has the most control over variables? And the answer is experiments. That's the main thing about experiments, is controlling variables. Which one of these gets at the deepest level? Yeah, deep understanding of a subject or group of subjects. Depth. And the advantage of case study is the answer. So case studies are all about getting deep, detailed information. But the disadvantage due to that is that you can't generalize that to everybody. It's just that one case or a few cases. You can't say that's all humans or all teenagers or all, Americans. So, by the way, let's flip that. So if that's the case, which one does have as its advantage? It's very generalizable to very large populations. Like, you get your results and you can infer that applies to all humans or all teenagers or all Americans. The answer there, survey. So surveys are very generalizable, but they're not very deep. If you ask 10 questions on the questionnaire, you only get 10 answers. So surveys are broad-reaching, case studies are deep-reaching. So surveys have their advantage because they're generalizable. Let's see, which one of these has its advantage that it gets the closest, out of these 4, it gets closest to an understanding of direct cause and effect relationships, that this is causing that? And the answer there, back to experiment. So experiments are important for understanding direct cause and effect because of what we said earlier, control. You're manipulating variables in a laboratory maybe, and you get a closer understanding of causation. But it's important that you understand the other 3 are more correlational. They don't, establish that this is a direct cause of something, but they do find that things are correlated. And there's a general principle that you may have heard: just because 2 things are correlated and seem related somehow does not mean causation. But experiments do get closer to that causation understanding. But generally speaking, correlation does not mean causation. The other 3 are establishing that, this is related to that, but not necessarily causing it. Let's see, which one of these would have as its advantage that it's how people normally behave. They don't, it's in a real situation. And of course, the answer there would be naturalistic observation. A naturalistic observation is that people are behaving naturally. They typically don't know they're being watched, right? They're out there on the street and you're watching them from afar and looking for certain behaviors. So that's great because when people know they're being watched, there might be that placebo effect maybe where they start to alter their behavior and, believe that you're after something, and so they start acting accordingly, and that's just not good science. So the problem there is, though, you're not controlling anything. You're watching them from afar, and there's no control and therefore less understanding of why they're behaving that way. So in a way, experiment is the opposite of that one. It's you're controlling things. But the problem there is that it's a laboratory, it's a fake artificial environment, and that may not translate out to the natural, normal world. And so, you may have your findings in a laboratory experiment, but it may not apply to the natural, normal way people behave. So now there's a lot of other disadvantages, advantages we could talk about. Those are some of the main ones you could take away. I would say, we'll get to some in a moment. I think you'll see. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so take a look here. Again, I'll call out some questions and see if you can match it up to the proper vocabulary here. So we were talking just now about research methods. Which one of these is a disadvantage for surveys when you're giving a survey? And the problem is that people answer the survey in a way that it's how they wish they were, not how they actually are. And maybe they're not doing it on purpose, but they answer in a way how they wish. It's wishful thinking. You can pause if you need to, but the answer is social desirability bias. People answer surveys in a way to make themselves more socially desirable. And you try to tell them this is anonymous and you don't put your name on it, be honest, but people still unconsciously perhaps answer in a way to make themselves more socially desirable. Which one of these is a term for evidence-based proof? And we've mentioned that already. Again, pause the screen if you need to, but empiricism, empirical, E for empirical. It's a principle of science that things need proof or evidence that you can observe. It's not just philosophy and logic. Let's see, which one of these is a research approach where you use a fake variable on a control group? And for example, if you're testing a medicine, you might give them a fake medicine, and that, of course, is a placebo. And a placebo is not always, just a fake medicine, by the way, but it's a fake variable you might use on the control group, so you can have a group set aside for comparison. Which one of these is the part of the experiment you're actually measuring? And that would be dependent variable. So you manipulate the independent variable in an experiment, and then you see how they respond to that manipulation, and that's the dependent variable, the response that you're measuring. All right, which one of these up here is what you do as soon as according to the APA rules, the rules of the AP, the American Psychological Association, the ethical rule that says as soon as you have your data in hand, you're supposed to debrief. Oh, did I just give that away? Debrief. Actually, it's not even on there. So, hey. Yeah, debriefing. Well, it's not on there. So, hey, debriefing is an ethical rule that as soon as you have your data, you're supposed to tell them right away, especially if you've deceived them, because they do deceive them a lot. And why do they deceive them? That's blindness. In a blind study, you leave your subjects in the dark, so to speak, to avoid the placebo effect we were talking about a moment ago. You don't tell them too much, or sometimes you lie to them. And so you must debrief them as soon as possible. Which one of these is, what you do, according to the APA, ethical rules, you must do before you carry out your experiment. In other words, you're getting permission from your subjects. And it's a kind of an AP popular question. It's informed consent. Before the subjects will go forward in your experiment, you can't coerce them or anything. So you must fully inform them as best you can without giving away the experiment, perhaps. Inform them as much as possible, and they must freely consent to doing it before you move forward. So professors, and typically these researchers are professors at colleges, they can't threaten to fail their students or anything if they don't volunteer to be in their laboratory on the weekend. They can offer incentives of various kinds, and if it is tied to the grade, they have to have alternatives, so that if they can't or don't want to be a part of the experiment, they can take the alternative to fulfill their grade requirement, but they can't coerce them. So which one of these, and this is an important one too, sometimes as an experimenter or researcher, your own judgment or expectation is a problem. Sometimes you see what you want to see, or sometimes your behavior might affect the subjects and make them behave accordingly, and that's not good science. You need to be objective. So sometimes you have a bias. So which of these up here is a safeguard that avoids your own experimenter bias from influencing your subjects or results? And the answer is a double-blind study. So a double-blind study is a safeguard to avoid experimenter bias. And there's various ways you can do that, where you have somebody else come in who doesn't know which group is which or something and take the data. Anyway, so a double-blind is important to avoid experimenter bias. Yeah. So let's see. I'm just calling these out randomly, but again, we could go beyond this screen here. There's plenty of vocabulary out there, and as I've said before, vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. It's probably one of the best things you can do is just drill the vocabulary in preparation for the AP exam. One more thing I would say is sometimes your experiments are overly complicated. There's too much going on, and they're not simple. And simple is good in an experiment. So you may not know why you got your results, and that's confounding variables. Extraneous variables are similar too. Extraneous variables are you've got your experiment, but things extra slip in. Something outside your control slips in and throws your results off, instead of the manipulation of your independent variable being what's causing the outcome. There's others here. Longitudinal study is a long-term study, so it might be tracking children as they grow up over decades, perhaps, a long-term study. Whereas cross-sectional study would be like, we could do it now. It doesn't have to be long-term, and we just get different age groups and compare them side by side. 3-year-olds with 6-year-olds, with 9-year-olds, with 12-year-olds on some task. And so that's cross-sectional, cross-section of different age groups in this case. Yeah. So, there's plenty of other vocabulary we could talk about with research methods. I just want to remind you that this area of psychology is a big one for the AP exam when it comes to your FRQs. One of your FRQs will be about research, experiments, and such. So this chapter was an important one for one of those FRQs. All right, to wrap up this, oh no, we got one more thing here before we get to social psychology. Take a moment and pause on the screen, and let's get down our statistics stuff. All right, the answers to these questions. Psychologists administering a survey rely on what technique to ensure the sample is representative of or generalizable to a larger population? Let's say, for example, you want to know what Americans think about the president. So you don't just ask people in Texas or Plano or Oklahoma, because that would be sampling bias. So you must use random sampling. So random sampling is the answer to one, not random assignment. A random assignment is what you do in an experiment where you've got all your volunteers and then you randomly assign them to the two groups to make sure they're balanced and there's not one that has an advantage over the other. So this is random sampling we're talking about in number one. Number two, bell curve or normal curve. They love these, like the one you're seeing there for number five. Number three, measure of central tendency. There's a central tendency, or what is normal or typical of a population. And so there's mean, median, and mode. And mean's great to show what's typical or average. Psychologists like to use that to express what's normal or typical. But sometimes it's a problem if you have freak scores, like extremely high incomes or data, or extremely low, and it pulls the average down or it pulls the average up. So it misrepresents what's normal. So sometimes the median or mode is a better thing to use in the case of extremely high or extremely low scores being mixed in your data. Number four, to determine how much variety there is among your data. How much variability, how much variety? Is it all tightly packed around the average, or is it spread out like really low and really high, a bunch in different directions? And that's, standard deviation is a pattern of deviation away from the norm and variability. So speaking of standard deviation, we're looking at that in number five. Now, you could memorize that formula. It's kind of lengthy for calculating standard deviation, or this pattern of deviation away from what's normal. So this is what's normal, right? Let's say it's shoe size, and I'm not sure what the average shoe size is, but you'd put that there. And then you'd calculate standard deviation, which is this pattern of deviation this way and this way away from the norm. So that's standard deviation. Well, we could just memorize these percentages, which I'll take you there now. So on any bell curve, whether you're talking about shoe size or IQ or weight of the population, and you first establish what's normal or average, and you put that's going to be there. And then you calculate standard deviation, and on any bell curve, 68% of the population will fall between this shoe size and this shoe size, or this IQ and that IQ. So it's always going to be 68% of the population, 34 plus 34. 95% of the population on any bell curve will fall between -2 and +2 standard deviations. So vastly most people. 95% of the population will have a shoe size between whatever shoe size that becomes or whatever shoe size that ends up being. And then 99% would be within 3 standard deviations. So standard deviation, it's a little confusing, but it's just a pattern of deviation away from the average norm, and it's always with these percentages. So that's one way to kind of shortcut that one. Now, maybe you want to know how 2 variables are related or correlated, and that's number 6, correlation coefficient. How strongly linked is, say, your SAT score and GPA? We know that those are somewhat correlated. They tend to move in the same direction, but how strongly? Or smoking and heart disease, or stress level and alcohol consumption, or amount of sleep and GPA or something. So correlation coefficient measures how strongly they're connected. And so now, what kind of graph would a psychologist or a statistician use to show correlation between 2 variables? Scatter plot is what they use. So you have a y-axis and an x-axis. So let's say GPA and SAT score. You got your GPA from the school on one axis, and then the SAT scores on the other axis, and then everybody's a dot on there. And so if those dots move at an upward direction, that would be a positive correlation. Or if the dots move in a downward slope, they tend downward, that's a negative or inverse correlation. So they are correlated, but in the opposite, like when one's high, the other one's low. If there's dots everywhere, that indicates there's no relationship, no correlation. So correlation coefficient measures how strong those 2 variables connect. And it's always on a scale of -1 to +1. So the closer it is to +1, so like 0.76, let's say, that's a pretty strong positive correlation up that scatter plot. The closer it is to -1, so, and it never goes outside of that range, so -0.92, that's a pretty strong negative correlation. The closer it is to the middle, which is 0, would indicate no relationship. So there'd be dots everywhere. And finally, number 7 and 8 should be pretty self-explanatory. So if-then statement, if it's their stated expectations of what they think was going to happen. The if part of the statement is the independent variable, and the then part of the statement is the dependent variable in any case. All right, so let's wrap up. Time for social psychology, and this will end our today's review. So on the left here, you have different social psychology terms, and on the right, you're going to get a clue. And again, just pause if you need to. All right, which of those options on the left goes with this study of 3 leadership styles? And the answer is Lewin. Kurt Lewin was one of the early pioneers of social psychology. L for Lewin, L for leadership. The answer is bystander effect, which happens because of a diffusion of responsibility, by the way. Diffusion of responsibility is the reason this happens. People feel diffused out when there's a lot of people around. And the answer is lowball effect, or the lowball tactic. So people, oh, what a bargain, and then they go buy it, and then as they're checking out, you need this and this, and then suddenly the price goes up, but they still follow through because they're hooked by that low price. They initially were caught their attention. And the answer is scarcity. So a scarcity tactic, by making things seem scarce or limited, people go buy it, like Black Friday sales and such. And the answer is probably the most famous social psychology experiment by Milgram. Stanley Milgram did this study where they told people to administer shocks to the person who misses questions in the next room. The person in the room is really an actor, though, not really getting shocked. They wanted to see how far people would go. And a popular question the AP people might ask is, what was the results? The results was that 2/3, about 65, 66%, went all the way to 450 volts, all the way to the end, because somebody told them to. And that's been replicated, and they found that tends to be the case through the decades. It wasn't just back in the 60s when they did that originally. And the answer is fundamental attribution error. It's a mouthful. So in attribution theory in psychology, which is how attribution in psychology is how we explain things in our mind, or how we blame things in our heads. Like, why did they behave that way? Oh, it must be because blah, blah, blah. So you're attaching a cause to what you're seeing. Fundamental attribution error, because we tend to attribute it to internal things. It's who they are. It's their disposition or personality, dispositional. Or we tend to make external attributions, which is situational, not who they are, but the situation they're in. It's external. The fundamental attribution error is an error in attributing, so it's an error in the way you're judging somebody by saying it's all because of them. It's all dispositional or internal. So you're saying it's because of them that they lost the game or their business failed, without considering the power of the external or situational forces that might have caused them to lose their business or lose the game or whatever. So we tend to do that. We tend to say it's them, internal, without considering the situational forces that might have contributed to their failure. The answer is mere exposure effect. That's basically product placement. We tend to be attracted to things we're familiar with. So with product placement, they subtly place it, merely place it in the background. So you can see Simpsons in the background, or a Coke can or Pepsi or something. And the more you see it, the more familiar you are, and therefore you're more likely to reach for it when you're at the grocery store. So mere exposure effect makes you desire it more because you become more familiar with it. This also applies not just to products, but also attraction, interpersonal attraction, sometimes. And the answer is social schema. It's important that you understand the word schema. It means framework of understanding, like your worldview, kind of. Social schema is a social situation, like what you would expect in a job interview, let's say, or a first date. You have certain ideas of how that's supposed to go. So a social schema. And the answer is social loafing. Similar to the bystander effect, in that there's this diffusion of self, or de-individuation, it might be called, a loss of individuality when you're in a large crowd. Well, if you've ever worked on group projects where there's like 8 people, they diffuse out. There's less responsibility, this de-individuation, so they put forth less effort, as opposed to if it was a smaller group where they felt more responsible. And the answer is Solomon Asch, back in the day, did a follow-up, did a conformity study. So they could actually get people to say the wrong answer, an obviously wrong answer with lines that clearly didn't match, but they got the person to answer along with the herd, along with the actors in the room who were pretending to be other subjects. And so conformity. Now, it's important to understand things that caused a drop in conformity. Like if these other people are giving the wrong answer, and so you're like, 2 + 2 is 5, 2 + 2 is 5, and you're like, okay, 2 + 2 is 5. But if just one of the other people, who is an actor, remember, gives the correct answer, 2 + 2 is 4, even though the others are all giving it wrong, just one person dissenting against the herd of sheep, it causes significant drop in conformity. There's other things too. They're all giving the same wrong answer, so that sense of unanimity among the herd of sheep giving the wrong answer increased conformity. So if suddenly they start giving a less unified answer, then it would be a drop in conformity. So that's some of the things that Asch found. Next question, and pause if you need more time. And this is defensive attribution. So again, attribution theory in psychology is how we attach cause or blame something we're observing. In this case, we make explanations or blame it on them. It's kind of fundamental attribution error again, because it makes us feel better or safer. It's defensive. So by saying it's them, why the failure happened, then we feel safer in that situation, when we might be victims of the same environmental situation. Pause if you need more time, and the answer is confirmation bias. Basically, we see what we want to see and ignore the rest. Yeah, we have a bias to confirm our beliefs. We notice those few examples that would support our view while overlooking vast amounts of information that would disconfirm it. And the answer is illusory correlation, literally illusion of two things being related when they're not really. So you wash your car, and it's related to confirmation bias. You only notice when you wash your car and then it rains the next day. You're like, see? While overlooking the many other times you might wash your car and it doesn't rain. We develop an illusory correlation because of confirmation bias. And the answer is reciprocity, reciprocating, which means kind of an exchange back and forth. If we think someone likes us, we tend to like them back. That's also part of the reciprocity there. If somebody gives us something, we feel obligated to reciprocate and give something back or donate to their cause or whatever. Next. And the answer is groupthink. Basically conformity of mind. It's dangerous. We all agree and agree and agree until bad things happen. When somebody needed to speak out, somebody needed to play devil's advocate to avoid bad things happening, when the group is all like, yes, yes, let's invade Cuba, or whatever the case is. Next. And the answer is central route to persuasion and peripheral. Central is appealing to logic. Peripheral is those outer other things, like emotional appeal, like patriotism or fear, whereas central is more logical. Both work. Peripheral works faster, but if people are very informed about the topic under argument, then central route to persuasion might be important. And the answer is foot in the door tactic. Simply put, small yeses make it easier for them to say the big yes. So you get them to agree to small things and they develop a kind of consensus. You're moving them, a commitment down to what you want them to say yes to. And the big yes is easier in that case than just asking them right up front for the money or whatever you're after. So foot in the door tactic. And a reverse of this, by the way, is the door in the face tactic, where people, you ask for something ridiculous that you know they're going to say no to, and you find that it's more likely they'll actually say yes when you ask for the actual request. So it's working in the opposite direction. That's called the door in the face. And the answer is self-fulfilling prophecy. It's almost synonymous with the Pygmalion effect. Basically, it's expectations. If you believe something or expect something, it's because you believe it that causes it to happen, when it wouldn't have otherwise if you didn't believe it. So that works for high expectations or low expectations. It causes other people's behavior to also rise or sink to that belief or expectation. The power of belief. It's a dangerous thing sometimes, or powerful thing. The answer? Group polarization. And this is important to understand. It's also kind of an AP favorite. If people already kind of agree on something, the longer time that they talk about it, this thing that they agree on, the more extreme that view will become with time and discussion. So time and discussion with people who already agree, and it's important that you understand that part, they eventually shift outward to a more radical position. The answer? Risky shift phenomenon. Basically, when there's more people around, we take riskier action and make riskier decisions. When it's only a few people or just you, we tend to be more cautious. And finally, I wonder what that could be. Just being in the presence of others facilitates. This is also social facilitation effect you may have heard of. So if you've practiced your free throws a lot, and then you step up in front of an audience, that you have people watching, it actually facilitates your performance. But if you've not, if it's a more difficult task or you haven't rehearsed, then it might cause you to choke, by the way. Mere presence is related to that, because the mere presence of other people, they don't even have to be watching, merely being in the presence of others actually bolsters facilitates your performance if you've rehearsed and are well prepared for it. So vocabulary, as we said, is really important. That concludes part 1. We'll get into part 2 next time. See you soon.